Well, I'm glad to have you on the Grand Dark Conspiracy. I guess we'll start off by getting into your new book. You want to kind of lay out what you intended to do with them.
Well, the book is Flying Saucers and Science. It was published in early June, late May. It just went into its third printing. It seems to be very popular. It's, in a sense, it's my magnum opus. I've been lecturing for 41 years, usually on the subject flying saucers are real. And all over the place. I've lectured at over 600 colleges and universities and over 100 professional groups, spoken in a total of all 50 U.S. states, 9 Canadian provinces, and 16 other countries. But lecturing has its limits, and I've published papers, I've given talks at more appearances at the Mutual UFO Network annual symposia than anybody. But there's a limit. I mean, you talk for 60 minutes, 90 minutes, you answer questions for a half hour to an hour. Still, there's a great deal of ground to cover. So what I tried to do in this book, I'm getting old, after all, is kind of provide one-stop shopping for people who have heard the nasty, noisy negativists tell you there's nothing to this subject, a popular viewpoint from the unenlightened, if you will, the ancient academics and fossilized physicists and SETI cultists. I mean, I tell it like it is, after all. So in one book, 320 pages, I've been able to deal in depth. For example, in my lecture at the beginning, I talk about 5 large-scale scientific studies. I show a slide, I tell you what's in the study, and then, of course, then I ask how many people have read it. And typically, I'm lucky if 1 or 2% have read any of them. Well, here I have a whole chapter in the book about these studies and much more detail about what's in them. There's a whole chapter on, I mean, the first objection, of course, is there is no evidence. This is from the people who haven't studied the evidence, but presume if there was any, they would have, and they haven't, so there must not be any. The second argument is that you can't get here from there. Einstein! You know, I'm a nuclear physicist, for goodness sakes. I know about Einstein, but these guys want to use half an Einstein. The speed of light is the limit, but they forget to tell you, oh yeah, as you get close to the speed of light, time slows down to the things moving that fast. And it matters a lot if you get close, like 99.99, and we physicists make particles that go a lot faster than that, a whole bunch of nines. Anyway, at just 99.99% of the speed of light, you can go 39 light years in a little over 6 months pilot time. They don't want to tell you that, you see, so they're using half an Einstein. You know? So I've got pictures in the book of nuclear rocket engines, and I talk about fusion rocket engines, and you know, it's amazing to me that some of the people most ignorant about advanced propulsion are the astronomers. Now, I say what's amazing about that is that all the astronomers know that the energy production process in the stars is nuclear fusion. It's not burning gas. I mean, we figured that out in 1938. And, I mean, the sun was fusioning for 4.5 billion years before that, but that's when we finally figured it out, which there's a lesson there, in other words, because you don't have an explanation for something doesn't mean it doesn't work. It just means you don't know enough. Anyway, 1938, a smart physicist, Hans Bethe, figured out how it worked, the sun, nuclear fusion. And there are a bunch of fusion reactions. We put it to use. 14 years later, 1952, we exploded our first H-bomb. That's a nuclear fusion device. And it had the power of 10 million tons of TNT. 10 million tons. Now, it is interesting that that bomb had a 3-mile-wide fireball. And I keep wondering, what did the aliens think about that? But it tells you something about planet Earth, doesn't it? That we're not producing electricity with fusion power. We're building bombs. The Russians, incidentally, exploded one that had 50 million tons of TNT equivalent. Which, if you dropped that in the middle of New Jersey, you'd start fires from New York to Philadelphia. To give you some ideas. So, and yet the astronomers seem to talk as if chemical rockets were the only way to go. And they objected to that for a very long time, too. And one of the things I try to do is put facts in the book and quote the people who said stupid things. The astronomer Royal, who said that space travel is utter bilge. The professor from New Zealand, a guy named Bickerton, who in 1926 told the British Association for the Advancement of Science that there was no possible way you could give anything sufficient energy to put it into orbit around the Earth. And one of my favorites, a Canadian astronomer, I'm a dual citizen of Canada and the United States. I complain about both governments legally. Dr. Campbell, 1941, calculated the required initial launch weight to get a rocket to the moon and back. Pages of equations. It would have to weigh 1 million tons. Now, even for me, that's too big. However, the Saturn V at launch was 3,000 tons. He was off a factor of 300 million because rocketry was something about which he knew absolutely nothing. He assumed a single-stage rocket, too low an exhaust velocity for the propellant. He assumed a limit of 1g acceleration. He assumed he had to supply all the energy. Well, cosmic freeloading is the way we do lots of things in space. When we go to the moon, we don't provide all the energy. We launch to the east from near the equator. That's at 3,000 miles an hour. It's a nice little bonus. We launch at just the right time, the so-called launch window, so that the moon will come along and pull us in. That saves a lot of energy, and the moon is quite reliable. When we come back, we don't use a retro rocket, which he presumed you'd have to do, and of course the fuel that you use at the end had to be launched from the Earth, slow down at the moon, launch from the moon. We say, thank you, God, for giving us an atmosphere, something to breathe, which is convenient, and we can slow down the rocket if we're smart enough. Remember Apollo 13, you better get the angle right or you're in deep trouble. So one of my rants in the book is before you listen to somebody say that something is impossible, examine his basic assumptions, and you'll find invariably that they're wrong because he's talking about something about which he knows nothing. So there's another chapter on the cult of SETI. This one gets people wrong, angry. SETI, silly effort to investigate. They say it means search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And I point out the lack of science and the basic assumptions about what they're doing. They think they can determine what kind of approach an advanced civilization would take to long-distance communication. They also assume they'd want to send us a signal. I don't know why. And certainly we've had advanced technology, first radio waves across the ocean, early 1900s, maybe 1902, I forget, something like that, 106 years. If somebody out there is a little more advanced than we are, he's going to know some things about which we know nothing because we're a primitive society. Our major activity, obviously, is tribal warfare. You don't have to look very far to see that. But suppose they were only 1,000 years ahead of us. You think they'd know some things we don't know? Look back 1,000 years. Look back 100 years. Look back 50 years. And how the world has changed. I used a slide rule when I started working in industry 50 years ago. Most people today don't even know what a slide rule is.
I couldn't use one, that's for sure.
I haven't handled one in a long time, but I said that to a whole class of students at the University of Detroit. And I looked around the class. Any of you know what a slide rule is? Not one student knew what it was, and that's less than 50 years. So my point is that you may raise the question, well, are there any solar systems older than ours? Well, my favorite solar system, two of them around the stars, Zeta 1 and Zeta 2 Reticuli, that's in the constellation of Reticulum. That means the net in Latin, I guess. These two, their identity as a likely place where there are advanced civilizations comes from the star map associated with the Betty and Barney Hill case, as described in the book, captured the Betty and Barney Hill UFO experience by myself and Kathleen Martin, Betty's niece, who has all her tapes, transcribed them all, and did a tremendous amount of work. I was sort of along for the ride. I played the heavy. I attacked the attackers and talked about the star map. But the intriguing thing, if you want a decent sense of perspective, It's those two stars. They're just down the street, 39.3 light years away. The galaxy's about 100,000 light years across, so obviously these are around the corner, so to speak. You can't see them from here. You got to go below the equator. Anyway, those two stars, 39.3 light years away from us, from each other, they're only an eighth of a light year apart. They're both sun-like stars. They're the closest to each other pair of sun-like stars in our entire neighborhood. An eighth of a light year apart. That means they're 35 times closer to each other than the sun is to the next star over. So we're out in the boonies. I don't mean Fredericton, New Brunswick, where I live in Canada. Lovely place. But they're they got next door neighbors, I guess is the simplest way to put it. From a planet around one, you can see planets around the other. And you can see the other star all day long. That's how close they are. But the interesting thing is those two stars are not only close to each other and sun-like, but they're a billion years older than our star, the sun. So we don't need to give them an extra billion years of development. And 500 would do it. Friedman's law, technological progress comes from doing things differently in an unpredictable way. I use a laser pointer at my lectures. A laser isn't just a better light bulb. I used to use a little sort of flashlight-like thing. But a laser requires entirely different physics. The fusion rockets I worked on back more than 40 years ago, if you use the right stuff in the right way, you can kick particles out the back end that have 10 million times as much energy per particle as they can get in a dumb old chemical rock. That was 40 years ago.
I mean,
so if these guys are a little more advanced than we are, boy, do they know a lot more than we do.
Yeah, I'm saying, I mean, how much further along do you think we need to get before we can create something that can propel us out of the solar system?
Oh, it shouldn't be a problem at all. It depends on how much money you want to spend. Could be, we could do it within 40 years if we wanted to. You know, I worked on a lot of large-scale advanced research and development programs. Almost all of them were canceled, you understand, but that's the story of my life, in a sense. But when I say large, when I worked on nuclear airplanes, the General Electric Aircraft Nuclear Propulsion Department in Evendale, Ohio, just outside Cincinnati. Back in 1958, we were spending $100 million that year. 3,500 people employed full-time, 1,100 of them engineers and scientists. That wasn't the largest development program around, but $100 million was a lot of money in 1958. It's not bad now, but still, we remember how things were in 1958. I don't know if you were alive then, but I remember.
No, it's a few decades before me. I'm a 70s child.
But you get some idea. I mean, you started with a master's degree at a little over $500 a month at that time. So what I'm getting at is, how long does it take? How much of a commitment do you want to make? The atomic bomb cost about $2 billion, which would be roughly the equivalent of $20 billion today. If you were going to spend $100 million a year on that, you'd never get it done back then. So, do we have a goal? That's the real problem. We are a little short of goals when it comes to space. Since President Kennedy said, let's get a man to the moon and back by the end of the decade, that was in 61, I guess, NASA really hasn't had a goal except to keep its budget money coming. They're thinking about considering the possibility of perhaps at some time maybe going back to the moon and maybe to Mars. Do they have a goal? No. They have some ideas that wouldn't it be nice if we could do that? Not the same thing. So all of these things, what I'm saying is we don't need to wait 1,000 years or 100 years. Depends on how much you really want to get to the goal. And I'm not in favor of pursuing the goal of getting to the stars until we have an Earthling organization to do it. Look, the United Nations doesn't allow cities to join. Why would the Galactic Federation, for want of a better term, allow countries to join. You got to represent the planet. And so, what are we going to do if we get out there? And, there's an old argument. Well, if you send our best system now, it's going to take quite a while to get there. Why don't you wait 20 years and we'll have a much better system and that'll get there sooner? And, and there's some truth to that. So the point is, we don't need to say that you need unknowingly using a completely fictional kind of notion, science fiction and all this stuff. No, that's not true. Now, remember, you don't expect professors to be developing these things. I was interviewed for an hour at the Goddard Museum in Roswell for the Peter Jennings February 24th, 2005 mockumentary about UFOs. I appeared in the show for 20 seconds, and they called me promoter twice. Didn't bother to mention I was a nuclear physicist and stuff like that. But when we finished the interview, and the interview went fine, the guy in charge, they're putting the equipment up, says, Stan, don't you think if these things were real, that half the professors in the country would be working on UFO-related research? And I said, absolutely not. Those who can do, those who can't teach. And that sounds crude, but let's face it. You want a stealth fighter, you go to Lockheed. You spend $10 billion in 10 years, and you build one. All the equipment kind of stuff, nuclear submarines, for example, or nuclear aircraft carriers, which incidentally can operate for 18 years without refueling, which is a pretty neat thing when you think about it. All of these programs, you go through industry. The NRO contracts for these things, National Reconnaissance Office. They announced a couple of years ago, well, actually last year, that they were canceling a program they had with Boeing to come up with a new architecture, fancy way of saying how the thing looks and works, of a spy satellite. They were canceling the program because Boeing's efforts hadn't been successful. They had only spent $18 billion. That's not 12 professors and 30 grad students, for goodness sakes.
Wow.
So what I'm saying is the public, and especially the ancient academics and fossilized physicists, have no concept of how much money is going on out there and what effort is going on. And they think that if you do any scientific work, you're going to publish in scientific journals, publish or perish. Well, the first nuclear chain reaction, Enrico Fermi at the University of Chicago, my alma mater, in 1942, was an earth-shaking event. It was an incredible effort. There's no paper. It was classified. All kinds of things you don't publish. I gave papers at classified meetings. I published classified reports. Worked with very sharp people. I didn't worry about publishing in a scientific journal. I didn't need that to get my assistant professor and associate professor and full professorship. It's accomplishment that matters, not how many papers you published. So the real world, in other words, is very different from that posed by these people. And what bothers me, here we have professional people, a lot of PhDs, for example, on the SETI program, who will blandly claim there is no evidence for UFOs. And I keep looking. I talk about 5 large-scale scientific studies in the book. You never find them referenced by these guys. I read their books. They don't read mine. They don't look at the evidence. And the whole approach is, look, if these things were real, I, who take great pride in my knowledge of what's important in the world, would know about it because it would be important. Nobody denies that if aliens were visiting, that would be a big story. And if the government is covering it up, that makes it an even bigger story. But their attitude is, well, if it were true, I would know about it because I'm so smart. And I don't, so it must not be true, and I'm not going to waste my time digging into that. Self-fulfilling prophecy, they call it. Besides which, obviously, if you're interested in the SETI business, and they keep saying, if we just listen long enough, we'll pick up a signal. Now, 30 years ago, within 20 years, and 20 years ago, within 20 years, and last year, within 20 years. We don't seem to get any closer. What they are doing is estimating now that the place from which the signal will come Now they're saying maybe 1,000 light years away. At one time they were saying 500, and they were saying 100 before that. So they keep getting farther away, these aliens. Isn't that amazing? So, to get back to the book, there is also a chapter that'll surprise some people about science fiction and flying saucers, UFOs. And in case people are wondering, why does he say flying saucers? That's a tabloid term. Why doesn't he say UFOs? Because, frankly, I'm not interested in UFOs. I'm interested in flying saucers. All flying saucers are UFOs. Very few UFOs are flying saucers. All great-grandfathers are men. Very few men are great-grandfathers. I'm interested in flying saucers, intelligently controlled extraterrestrial spacecraft. And sure, most sightings can be explained as relatively conventional phenomena, but isn't it amazing how the debunkers have a split personality? If we can explain a case as, say, Venus, it's because the witness was a reliable observer. He pointed out what direction it was, what angle above the horizon, what time it was, what its characteristics were. I go and check. Yeah, that was Venus. But if the same guy were to tell us, well, it moved very rapidly, then stopped dead, didn't make any noise, moved straight up, then went out and made a right angle turn, and then another one, he's a poor observer. You can't have it both ways. He's only a good observer when you can identify what he saw? No, the proof of the pudding is that we can explain most sightings because people are good observers or poor interpreters. Why should they know that it was whatever it was? They might not even know anything about Venus or all the other things that people don't understand when they first see them, but that an experienced investigator can conjure up. So there's a land of contradictions here. The noisy negativists make claims, unsubstantiated claims. They'll say there is no physical evidence, for example. Now, a guy named Ted Phillips in Missouri has collected well over 3,000 physical trace cases from 92 countries. That's his latest number. I saw him a couple weeks ago. He's been doing this for 40 years. These are cases where the saucer is seen on or near the ground, and after it leaves, one finds physical changes where it was observed. You get the equivalent of burnt circles, burn rings, landing gear marks, dried out soil. These are not crop circles or anything like that. These are physical trace cases. And in 1/6 of those cases, beings are seen external to the saucer that's landed or through windows. Now, after your first couple hundred, they're dull. Same thing keeps happening all over the world. So, but the people will tell you there is no evidence. I just read a rather good paper, one of the few in recent years in an academic journal, about saucers, about UFOs, and had some very good things to say. But it passed off Roswell as just a conspiracy theory. Now, I'm the original civilian investigator in the Roswell incident, starting, 1978, talking to Major Jesse Marcel. It's not a conspiracy theory. All kinds of first-hand witnesses, including, for example, a retired Air Force general who was the chief of staff for General Roger Ramey, who was head of the 8th Air Force, which was over the 509 bomb group, which was the group at Roswell. I mean, these were a bunch of dinks. They only dropped the first and second atomic bombs, the only 2 used in war, and then they tested 2 more out in the Pacific. The only nuclear atom bomb outfit, if you will, in the whole world. They were under General Ramey, his chief of staff, whom I found. He took the call from Ramey's boss. And this is on tape. Well, it's in the DVD now. We don't say tape anymore, I guess. And he told me, in person, not third hand, he took the call from General Ramey's boss, a guy named Clements McMullen. They knew each other. Both were West Pointers, incidentally. And so was Ramey, and so was Colonel Blanchard, who was head of the group at Roswell. And McMullen told him 3 things. He said, this is after the press release had gone out, which made front-page headlines from Chicago West because of the timing of the release, too late for the East Coast and for the morning papers. He said, get the press off our back. I don't care how you do it. Send some of that wreckage up here today with one of your Colonel Couriers and I don't want you ever to talk about it again, not even with your buddy Roger Ramey. That's an order. Do I need to put it in writing, Colonel? No, sir. When a two-star general tells a colonel what to do, he does it. This is 1947, you understand. Both West Pointers. So when you got witnesses like that, you're not talking conspiracy theories. And when you got newspaper articles from all over and all kinds of other testimony, like from Major Marcel, who was the intelligence officer for the 509, the most elite military group in the world. You don't get to be that by being some kind of a dumb dink. There are lots of other witnesses, too. So it's amazing how this article, incidentally, which is pretty good, has some weak spots. One of them, they seem to think that the subject of UFOs is kind of a taboo among academics, and I'd agree with that. Most academics are terribly frightened of even talking about it because it will reflect badly on their reputation. Oh, my goodness. But they don't think the government's really doing anything. And they came up with a new word, which I like, securitize, meaning covering up. Well, as I point out in the book, I talk about the cosmic Watergate, and the subject has been securitized. The NSA, National Security Agency, they're the guys who listen in on everybody's conversation everywhere.
Listening now.
After a court battle, they admitted they had 160 pages of top-secret Umbra UFO materials, but they couldn't release them because of sources and methods information. That was 1980, mind you. 1997, because some of the rules had changed, and because there was pressure, and because they got a letter from Philip Glass, a noisy negativist, telling him that Friedman always shows those blacked-out documents. There was one document, that a document for a federal court judge, which was like 80% blacked out. This is justifying the withholding of the other 160 pages. And Glass wrote them saying, Friedman shows that, and he doesn't tell people its sources and methods, which of course I do, the reason that the stuff is blacked out. So now they put out 160 pages of NSA UFO materials, and it's all whited out instead of blacked out, except for about 1 or 2 lines per page. And so you're going to tell me there's no cover-up? I've had people in ufology tell me that. I said, well, can you read what's under the whiteout? Well, no. Well, then it isn't released. And don't tell me it's 98% sources and methods information. Why is it filed under UFOs, you know? And the CIA, of course, says it took me 5 years to get their top-secret Umbra classified UFO documents. I got a few of them. The rest they withheld. But you can read 8 words on a page. The rest is blacked out. They didn't go to whiting out for some reason or other. So it's easy to demonstrate. Well, there's a straightforward statement by somebody most people have never heard of, Air Force General Carol Bolender, Tarrolll and Bolender. He was an engineer who worked on the Lunar Excursion Module program. We landed successfully on the moon in 1969. And his first assignment after that was, what should we do about the old Project Blue Book? Because the University of Colorado study, which was released in early 1969, recommended that it be closed because it really wasn't contributing anything to intelligence or technology. Well, they were certainly right about that. Anyway, he had no previous connections with UFOs. He was busy on the Lunar Excursion Module program, as he put it, 12-hour days. I found him years later, after I got the document. Anyway, in this document it says, moreover, reports of UFOs which could affect national security are made in accordance with JNAP 146, that's Joint Army-Navy Air Force Publication 146, or Air Force Manual 55-11, and are not part of the Blue Book system, which is a very profound statement. And 2 paragraphs later, he says, if we close Project Blue Book, the public won't have a place to report sightings. However, as previously noted, reports which could affect national security will continue to be investigated using the procedures established for that purpose. Here's an Air Force general, and I found him, and he knew what he was saying that the significant reports. Suppose a saucer flies down the runway at a SAC base, Strategic Air Command, where nuclear weapons are stored. That's a national security problem. If you and I were to stand at the end of my driveway and watch a saucer fly over, yeah, happens all the time. No national security there. Now, the press has never picked up on that. But certainly, where are those reports? We've never seen them from the people who submitted the reports to JNAP 46 or Air Force Manual 55-11. So it's easy to establish that there's a cover-up. Not just showing blacked out and whited out documents. I mean, that's handy. It's a quick response kind of thing. So the academics will usually tell you that there's no way you can keep things secret. Well, let's give a couple of examples. The Corona spy satellite, when finally successful after 12 failures, all in secret, I might add, got more data on Soviet military installations than all the U-2 flights which had preceded it. That was in the 60s. This first successful flight was 1960. The first public discussion about the Corona spy satellite was in 1995. 35 years. The NRO, National Reconnaissance Office, admitted in 2005 that it had launched 7 Poppy satellites to spy on Soviet ships at sea, their electronic communications, radar emissions, all that sort of stuff. They were launched between 1962 and 1971. First public discussion, 2005. And the NRO has a reputation for satellites that can cost $500 million for one satellite. Again, that's not 12 professors and 30 grad students. So secrets can be kept, are being kept. I had a Q clearance working on nuclear stuff for 14 years. I wrote classified documents. I've been to 20 archives, looked at loads of declassified documents and ran up against limits on all kinds of stuff that's still classified. There's another thing. People tell me, Stan, all that stuff is always declassified after 15 or 20 or 25 years. Balderdash. The Eisenhower Library still has 300,000 pages of classified material. He went out of office in 1961. So there's a real world, and there's the imaginary world put out by the nasty, noisy negativists, the debunkers. 4 basic rules for debunking, and this applies to anything unusual. But the public doesn't know. I'm not going to tell them. Don't bother me with the facts. My mind's made up. If you can't attack the data, attack the people. It's a lot easier, and nobody will know the difference. And do your research by proclamation. Investigation's too much trouble. And again, nobody will know the difference anyway. So these guys get away with this kind of nonsense. And every once in a while, there's somebody like me or other good professionals in the field who take them on and show that what they're saying simply isn't true. I was on Coast to Coast Radio with Dr. Michael Shermer, head of the Skeptic Society.
I'm aware of that. I believe I actually listened to that.
Well, he started off by, we did 3 hours. This is after we'd been on the Larry King show together. He was sitting next to me playing with little alien dolls. That was his contribution to scientific ufology. Anyway, he starts off the show by making a proclamation. Look, as with any strange phenomenon, there's a residue effect. You'll never explain everything. 5% of the cases can't be explained. That's no big deal. Well, could that give me an opening you could drive a truck through? And I did. I pointed out in Blue Book Special Report 14, largest study ever done for the Air Force, conspicuous in its absence in the reports of the debunkers, in the books, the papers, etc. I pointed out that in that study, 21.5% of the cases couldn't be explained, not 5%, and it was completely separate from the 9.3% for which there was insufficient information. This is despite the fact that the Secretary of the Air Force, that's a pretty high-ranking official, I would say. This is in 1955, and they've been lying ever since. But what he said was, on the basis of this report, we believe that no objects such as those properly described as flying saucers have overflown the United States. Even the unknown 3% could have been identified as conventional phenomena or illusions if more complete observational data had been available. Well, that takes care of it. He lied. The unknowns were 21.5%, not 3%. And by definition, their own definition, they didn't distribute the report, but I got a copy. There was a separate category called insufficient information. So I named 4 other large-scale scientific studies for Michael, and he got 20% of the vote when the vote came in after 3 hours of hard debating. But he hadn't done any homework. I read 2 of his books and quoted back some of the silly things he said. Don't bother me with the facts. My mind's made up. Somebody has to expose these guys, and I guess I've been elected. I was in high school debating, and so I'm accustomed to taking on people. And one of the basic rules of debating, at least when I was doing it a long time ago, is you got to know both sides of the issue, because the next time you may be debating on the negative instead of the positive side. And one thing that's conspicuous by its absence on the part of the debunkers is they don't know the pro side. So, in other words, the real world, as portrayed in the book, Flying Saucers and Science, and you can get it from standard bookstores or from my website, www.stantonfriedman.com, or Amazon.com, or whatever you want. It's not a privately published thing. If you get it from me, you get an autograph. Free. No extra charge for the autograph. And it's listed on the website with 3 other of my books, including last year's Capture, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO experience that I've already mentioned. But there's a real world out there of facts and data, and you sure won't find it by looking at the words of the noisy negativists, which is kind of a shame.
Do you think, like you said, you mentioned securitized documents?
Yeah.
Do you think the motive behind that possibly is to protect the sovereignty of a nation? Because it seems to me every nation seems to have some kind of secret cache of UFO documents. And
well, yeah, I'm glad you used that term. That's the article that I mentioned was about sovereignty and UFOs. I give 6 reasons for the cover-up. On my website at www.stantonfriedman.com, there's a paper on the UFO why questions, and there's a whole chapter in the book on that. And of course, one of the questions is, why the cover-up? Are they fearful of panic, war of the worlds kind of thing? I don't think so. I think the first concern is, how do the darn things work? They make wonderful weapons delivery and defense systems. Look at all the money we spend on those systems. Like I said, the stealth fighter, $10 billion in 10 years of effort by Lockheed. You got wreckage from Roswell. See my book, Crash at Corona. There's a chapter in Flying Saucers and Science, an update on the Roswell incident. But you got wreckage. You set up your secret program. Remember, this was in New Mexico, where much of the Manhattan Project was conducted to develop nuclear weapons. So they had procedures in place. The most classified state in the country. 2 of the 3 nuclear weapons labs are there. White Sands Missile Range was there, fire and capture German V-2s. That's a great place for covering things up. But you set up your secret project. Rule number 1 for security is that you can't tell your friends without telling your enemies, because they listen to the radio too, and they watch television and read newspapers. The second problem is the other side of the same coin. What if somebody else figures out how they work before you do? You don't want them to know, they know, we've been playing this weapon, counter-weapon, counter-weapon for a long time. We spend a lot of money trying to figure out the other guy's capabilities so we can do something about it when push comes to shove. The third problem is quite different. I'll call it a geopolitical problem. If there were to be an announcement tomorrow by highly trusted individuals, and we should have a competition, who does the world trust? My favorite odd couple is the Queen and the Pope. They're about the same age, what the heck? And they're not a threat to anybody, really, I don't suppose. Anyway, what if they were to make an announcement that indeed some UFOs are alien spacecraft, and they're neutral, let's say. They're doing their thing. What would happen? Well, the stock market would go down, and the mental hospital admissions would go up. and the church attendance would go up. But I think based on the more than 600 college lectures that I've given, that the younger generation, which unlike old guys like me, was never alive when there wasn't a space program, would immediately push for a new view of ourselves. We're talking about sovereignty. As Earthlings, instead of as Americans, Brits, Canadians, Peruvians, Cubans, whatever. Funny thing, I don't think there's any government on this planet that wants its citizens to owe their primary allegiance to the planet instead of their own. Government nationalism is the only game in town that I can find. You know, and people say, well, wait a minute, we'll just elect a leader. Really? China has 1.32 billion people. India has 1 billion people. We only have 300 million. We're going to have a popular election? Forget it. No government wants to do that. The fourth problem is very different. In the United States, at least, there are certain fundamentalists, religious fundamentalists, who have loudly proclaimed, we are the only intelligent life in the universe. That's Pat Robertson, the late Jerry Falwell. Can you imagine what an insult to God that is to think that this is the best she can do? You know, we killed 50 million of our own kind during World War II. 30,000 children died needlessly of preventable disease and starvation every single day. And this is the best that God could do? You know, I don't think so. But these guys would be up the creek without a religious paddle, and remember how close they were to the Republican administrations for a number of years. Finally, or not finally, but fifth out of six, is that people say to me, well, look, Stan, if aliens are coming here, and we're not going there, obviously they're more advanced than we are. And that means that soon there'll be new methods of energy production. We just knocked off the oil industry. There'll be new methods of ground and air transport. There goes cars and planes. There'll be new methods of computers and communication systems. There goes those industries. Economic chaos. We don't know how to handle that very well. And finally, a sixth reason. In the course of my lecture, I have over the years heard about seven different times when more saucers or more airplanes went up than came back down, chasing saucers. We know, and this is in the new book, Shoot Them Down by Frank Ficino Jr. It'll be a primary focus of a big meeting in St. Albans, right next to Charleston, West Virginia, on September 12th and 13th, about the big year of 1952, which included the Flatwoods Monster and so forth. But we have proof that military jet fighter plane pilots were ordered to shoot down UFOs if they don't land when instructed to do so. And an Air Force general said, we've scrambled them more than 300 times. This was in 1952. Well, apparently, sometimes they shot back. Now, if I've heard 7 instances, and I've only given 700 lectures, surely there are a lot of other instances that I've never heard of. You think the government's going to tell people that, if you're going to be a fighter pilot, you got to be a little wary. If you try to shoot down UFOs, they might shoot back. And so, and people look at me and say, Stan, you're telling me they didn't tell the families what happened to their husbands or sons or brothers? And I'm saying, of course they didn't. Let me give you an example. There's a book, By Any Means Necessary, by William Burroughs, Burrows, published in 2001. He's a historian, journalist. It's about 166 military crewmen on board reconnaissance planes that were charged with the responsibility of flying close to North Korea, China, and Russia. Now, sometimes we cross the border, slightly in violation of international law. And apparently the Russians shot down a bunch of these planes, including 166 crewmen. Was there any public discussion? Not a bit. Were the families told what happened to their family members? Not a bit. Of course, we shot down some Russian ones, too, and we didn't hear about that either. Now, some of these guys bailed out, and there was radio communications and stuff. It wasn't until the year 2001, more than 50 years after some of these events took place, that families were brought together at a conference on the East Coast and given medals and told what happened to their loved ones. More than 50 years for some of these cases. Would government keep secret the fact that planes have been destroyed by UFOs? Well, kind of interesting. You read the New York Times between 1950 and 51 and 56, 204 military jet interceptors had fatal crashes. Not just an accident, fatal crashes. And more than 60 of the crew members didn't bail out, which is quite extraordinary. And the New York Times used words like disappeared, disintegrated, vanished. 5 of the pilots, there were over 200 crew members involved. Some of the planes had 2 crew members, a radar operator and a pilot. Others didn't, just one. 5 of the pilots who went down had more than 100 missions in Korea, where, as you may recall, they were being attacked by MiG fighters, which weren't bad airplanes. They survived that. That's a lot of missions. And they come back to the United States where there aren't any MiGs, and they crash. And there were several accidents that involved 2, 3, or 4 planes at once. And it wasn't a mid-air collision. What the heck is going on here? The simple answer is we don't know. But you can imagine that the government is very reluctant to say that, oh, we can't really defend our airspace very well, folks. Sorry about that. They couldn't say that. It'd be nice if they told us the truth.
Well, we can't count on the government to tell us the truth. They've got to
No.
protect us from ourselves.
Yes.
I mean, to me, that's a fascinating thing to think about, that possible alien hostility is a reason that they would not give us any information about it. And then
hey, you're going to shoot at them, they'll shoot back.
Yeah.
What can I tell you?
And I thought it was interesting you mentioned the religious aspect of possibly withholding. I mean, I don't think you held up 2 of the greatest bastions of Christianity, but I never understood where the resistance was from that. It doesn't say anywhere in the Bible that we're all of creation.
Well, some people think that because it doesn't say, hey, they saw flying saucers, that there weren't any observed. And there's a wonderful book, The Bible and Flying Saucers, by Dr. Barry Downing, which goes through the Old and New Testaments. But now, there are some religions, the Buddhist, the Hindu, the Muslim, the Mormon, who say in God's universe there are many mansions. They say there's life all over the place out there. And as a matter of fact, one of the intriguing developments over the last several months, there had earlier, over the last few years, been statements by a Father Balducci connected with the Vatican, at UFO conferences, mind you, where basically he said, well, there's no reason to say that there can't be life out there, other intelligent life out there. Well, he is connected with the Vatican, but doesn't have a high position. Well, several months ago, the head of one of the 2 Vatican observatories basically said the same thing. And amazingly, somebody asked the Pope about it a couple months ago, and he too said the same thing. There's nothing that prevents Catholics from thinking there's alien life. Now you wonder, does he know something we don't know? Maybe he's getting his flock ready to jump on the bandwagon, or at least not stay away from it because they think he wouldn't approve. I don't know. But you wonder what's going on out there. He's not talking to me, you understand.
I'm sure the Pope knows a lot that we don't know because he's the Pope, and
Sure.
I think they have one of the largest hidden libraries out there. And
well, they also probably get some input from confessions, don't you think? I'm not a Catholic, and I don't mean that they spread what they hear, that priests do that, but they might tell the man on high, don't you think?
well, I think they just might. I don't think that's unreasonable at all. And like you mentioned the Bible and the UFOs, the Bible mentions a lot of things, and I think the Bible's pretty direct on what is and what isn't, and if it's not mentioning it, it doesn't preclude it. It just means it's not important to living your life, that there might be something else out there.
Well, remember the what's that phrase about the giants from out, the men from out there, and the woman of earth?
The men of great renown, the Nephilim, and is that what you're...
Well, no, there's part of that. There's a whole bunch of stuff, and Dr. Downing's book is an excellent read. Barry Downing, The Bible and Flying Saucers. He goes through the Old and New Testaments, and he's got an interesting background, a bachelor's of physics in physics and a doctor of divinity.
Oh,
so
wow.
divine physics is his beat.
Yeah.
Interesting combination, and he does a fine job. He's got a good sense of humor, too, I might add. So for people who want to know, look into the... Now, of course, the word flying saucer isn't there. They didn't use saucers back then. You know, what do you expect? Pillar of fire by night, cloud by day, Ezekiel's wheel, which was obviously a mechanical device of some kind. You know, you got to know the language. I looked at Genesis 18 and 19, I think it is, the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yeah.
And if you look through that, it's not a long portion of the Bible. Sounds to me, there were several things. First of all, Abraham and the strangers, who, there's a crazy thing about, you know, you don't, they want to pay him in effect for treating them nicely, washing their feet, feeding them and all this stuff. Hey, no, I'm rich. Well, Abe, if you had your druthers, what would you like? Well, silly question. But, you know, it would be nice if Sarah had a child so that I wouldn't have this rivalry between Sarah and Hagar, you know, Ishmael and so forth. Abe, don't worry about a thing. We'll take care of it. She had a son, you know, not very long thereafter. Then the next part of the story, the strangers go to Sodom, to Lot's house. Lot is Abe's nephew. And they come to Lot's place, and then the men from the town come hammering at the door. They want the men, so that these strangers, so that they can have some homosexual fun with them. And in one of the strangest expressions in the Bible, Lot suggests they take his virgin daughters, you know, which is very strange. Instead, who are you to tell us what to do? But the strangers make a bright light which temporarily blinds them, according to the commentary. Now, how do you do that? Now, you say, well, they used a laser. Sure, where'd they get it back then, you know, or electrical spark or whatever. So we already got a strange event going on. Then we have the strangers telling Lot to get ye to the hills, lest ye be swept away. One of the things that happens when a nuclear weapon goes off is you get a real shock wave. And they tell Lot's wife, who lagged behind Lot, not to look back. Now, the eyes are very sensitive to radiation. And she did, and she was turned to a pillar of stone. Salt, really, but salt is a generic term for chemical compounds. And at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there were people who were turned to a pillar of salt who were in the wrong place when the bombs went off. And then there's the crazy ending of this story. Lot had taken his 2 virgin daughters with him out to this little outside town, and the smoke went up from the town like from a kiln, which sounds like you know, what happens when a nuclear weapon goes off, a mushroom cloud. But beyond that, there's nobody there who can make the girls pregnant. So they seduce Lot a couple of nights in a row, and they each get pregnant. Now, incest has been strongly attacked in the Bible before that, but there's no condemnation. So what's going on here? That sounds like a radiation effect. So, you know, I spent a little time on this. I know a real Bible scholar, and we went over this, and he does his own translations and stuff. He agreed it would take us 3 months to do a monograph on 2 verses in the Bible, because you got to look at the language. So it's a fruitful area for research. There have only been 10 PhD theses, and the paper that I mentioned earlier doesn't mention any of them. This academic paper. But there have been at least 10. They're listed in my book, Top Secret Magic. There's a 10-page bibliography. and there may have been more in the last couple of years, I don't know. But there are a number of areas here suitable for research. One of those theses, incidentally, dealt with press coverage and had some strong things to say, and I have a whole chapter in Flying Saucers and Science that deals with the lousy press coverage, to use my term, the failure of the press to do its job, the failure of the scientific community to do its job. You see, when I was young, I foolishly thought that both journalists and scientists had the same goal: to get at the facts. The facts, man, that's all I want, truth. Well, I learned, it didn't take me too long, once I started work, to realize that neither group was totally motivated by the facts. They're protecting self, protecting their reputation.
Seems to me that those types of people that just try for the facts seem to lack a scope of imagination that allows them to be inquisitive enough to tackle a subject like UFOs or something greater beyond what they already know.
Well, you got to admit ignorance, don't you?
Yeah.
Well, some people don't want to do that. Hey, they got a piled higher and deeper degree. Why should they admit ignorance? Or journalists. I've got a name for the condition. It's the David Susskind syndrome. David had a talk show, a television talk show, back in the early 70s. And I had a call from his people. He was living in Southern California, and he wanted to do a show about UFOs. There'd been a big wave of sightings, and everything he wanted, he got. I gave him a good abductee, Betty Hill. He wanted a good skeptic. I said there aren't any, but here's how to reach Phil Class. He wanted a bunch of papers and so forth. A good recent case, and the Quine helicopter case had taken place, I think, 2 weeks earlier. Anyway, they brought me to New York for one night, and while we're taping segments of this show, he says, look, I read the New York Times. There's nothing in there that says these things are real. So the Susskind syndrome, it starts with the assumption that I am very smart and keep tabs on everything that's important in the world. And if flying saucers indeed were real, and there was a government cover-up, that would be important. Nobody denies that. But if it were important, I would know about it, and I don't, so it must not be, and I'm not going to waste my time looking for information about something that doesn't exist. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then they can say, there is no evidence. Well, that kind of disease, there's one cure for it: knowledge. That's why I wrote my book, Flying Saucers and Science, to cure the disease of there is no data.
Well, we know the data's out there, so I would advise anyone to pick up the book. It's a good read.
Good.
I've got a few listener questions here. I think it's about 5, so if we can go ahead and get to those. The first one is Kay O'Presley from our forums, and she wants to know what you think about L.A. Marzulli's take on Roswell. Something about it being a Luciferian plot.
Being a what?
A Luciferian plot. This is...
Ooh. Oh, the devil made me do it, huh? Yeah, I think there's no substance to that at all. There's an enormous amount of evidence, facts, data, not only personal testimony, but if you look at all the newspaper coverage. Remember, that was before television. Most people didn't have television in 1947. So the news was covered by newspapers, calling Roswell, for example, calling the base, calling the sheriff's office. And as you move across the country, because of the time changes, the articles get bigger and bigger and bigger. And so press coverage was pretty good. And if you look hard enough, everybody shows the article from the Roswell Daily Record. Well, how about the Chicago Daily News? How about the Los Angeles Herald Express? How about the Sacramento Bee and the Spokane Chronicle? There's a whole bunch of big, respectable newspapers that had front-page articles. It wasn't just wire service stories, in other words. No, if you look at my research in Crash at Corona, the definitive study of the Roswell incident, it's listed on the website at www.stantonfriedman.com, and it's available in some stores. It's not nearly as available as Top Secret Magic and Flying Saucers and Science and Captured the Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experiences. It's the earliest of my books, so it's the least available. But there are facts and data, and forget Lucifer.
Okay, Brian Parsons wrote in. He says, do you feel the FAA release of radar data surrounding the Stephenville, Texas UFO sighting earlier this year has anything to do with acclimating the public to the existence of UFOs, or is this a mere policy change to provide disinformation in the future to continue cover-ups?
It's a very interesting question. The MUFON people who went after that data and then had it analyzed by a guy who's analyzed 2 million radar tracks. Wow. It was presented at the conference, the annual conference in late July in San Jose. They used a sort of backdoor approach. The same thing had happened with regard to the O'Hare Airport sighting on November 7th, 2006. That's the one that made the front page of the Chicago Tribune on January 1st, 2007, and got more hits on their website, over 1 million, than any article they'd ever published about anything, much to their astonishment, incidentally. They had used freedom of information. They get the FAA, which originally said, we don't know anything about a sighting over O'Hare. They got the record, and it turned out the FAA did know something about that. In other words, they lie if they think they can get away with it. So I don't think that release was part of a scheduled, hey, we're going to put everything out there, folks. I think the people were sort of trapped. They had to put out something. And remember, the Air Force had already made an ass out of itself by saying, no, there weren't any F-16s flying then, as people had described. And then 10 days later, oh, you know what? There were 10 F-16s. Somehow they lost 10 for 10 days. It sounded pretty stupid, frankly. They had egg on their face. So in this case, the FAA, and that was the Air Force, the FAA did its thing and released its records. We didn't get all the records from the Air Force, incidentally. But the FAA was quite enough to say that, yes, there were F-16s flying, and then there was this huge thing that didn't have a transponder on it that actually stopped in midair for a while. Pretty neat trick for any plane. And then moved very rapidly and was huge. Now, that sure wasn't anything we had. Incidentally, this is not far from Crawfordsville, where the president's place was, you may recall, which may have something to do with why they were monitoring the area closely anyway.
Okay, we've got one, actually two from the Mans. It says, is there anything that could convince you that aliens don't exist?
Well, I'd have to throw out all the evidence that we have. There's an enormous amount of evidence, not only the physical trace cases and the 5 large-scale scientific studies and the testimony of people who were involved and the blacked-out documents and whited-out documents. The biggest argument, and people tend to forget this, if these were hours of earthling orientation, in other words, their origination, why weren't they used in any of the wars that we have had? We built the stealth fighter, we used it. But we had wars in, you may recall, well, maybe you don't recall, I do, I'm old enough. There was a war in Korea. There was a war in Vietnam. There were a couple of wars in the Gulf. And a few other little, what's the term, police actions. If these were ours or anybody on this planet, they would have been used in warfare. That's the only reason for building things with these kinds of characteristics. And they haven't been. So I don't see how you could have negative evidence. Sure, most sightings can be explained. So what? Hey, the basketball coach, he knows that most people aren't 7 feet tall. He says, don't tell me about the midgets. Give me the 7-footer. I don't care about the rest of the guy. One will do. And the same with me as a nuclear physicist. There's only a couple of isotopes that are naturally occurring that you can use to conduct a nuclear chain reaction. The fact that there are hundreds that aren't useful doesn't mean there aren't 1 or 2 that are. They're the ones you use. So the same with the medical situations. When I was at Rutgers University, the microbiology department gathered samples of soil from all over the world, thousands of them. And they extracted various chemical compounds, and they tried them against various bacteria and viruses and stuff. And on the bacteria, they found a few that worked. And a guy got a Nobel Prize for discovering a cure for tuberculosis. The great majority of the chemicals wouldn't cure anything. It's the ones that did that mattered. So, you can't say because these 10 don't affect the disease that there aren't any that do. You just got to be patient.
He also says he wanted to know what you think about human beings being seeded by aliens or aided in the process of evolution.
Well, that's an interesting question because I allow for the possibility that we're the result of somebody's colonization and migration. The SETI folks, they don't allow for any colonization or migration. Because then they'd have to admit that somebody could be coming here, you see. Remember, I'd like to think of this as a penal colony. They dumped all the bad boys and girls here, and that's why we're so nasty to each other. And don't forget, Australia and the state of Georgia were both started by convicts. Australia takes great pride in that, incidentally. So I don't rule out, there's another part of this, too. The Earth is roughly 4.5 billion years old. We know very little of the history of the planet back, say, 1 million years. What's his name? Henrik Schliemann thought he figured out where Troy ought to be, from the Iliad and the Odyssey and stuff. And the historian said, what are you talking about? There was no Troy. If that were true, we historians would know about it. It's mythical. Don't you understand? Well, he was rich, so he could afford to pay people to dig down 75 feet at the place where he figured out Troy ought to be from the Iliad. And you know what? They found Troy. Now, how much of the planet have we explored down 75 feet? And that's only from a few thousand years ago. So for all I know, there have been 10 different civilizations here to which bad things happened. A nuclear war, an asteroid crash, a comet, whatever. Nuclear winter, all those sorts of things. We don't know much about the past of this planet. And so there may have been a competition. Hey, everybody sends 20 people there, and let's see what happens over a period of time. They got nothing else to do out there, maybe they have run genetic experiments. Now, if I'd said that 50 years ago, you say, what are you talking about, genetic experiments? Well, they didn't know about DNA back then. Now you can find out who was smoking a cigarette from the saliva that's on the butt. That's pretty impressive to me. And genetic manipulation, we're starting to do it. We have done it. So who's to say that aliens haven't had a nice little laboratory here? Mix an ape with an alien from somewhere and see what you get. Take the genetic material from both. Mix and stir and see what happens. So I leave room for that.
I got one last question here from a forum member, our newest one, Knucklehead. He wants to know if it's true that the Foo Fighters in World War II could have possibly been Nazi experimental crafts.
Well, there's no question that both the Germans and the Allies in the European theater and the Japanese and the Allies in Japan saw these Foo Fighters and balls of light which seemed to play games with the airplanes. And do I think they were German technology? No, because when the pilots got together after the war, and pilots will talk to their enemies or anybody else after the war's over, each side thought they were the other's secret weapons. And I certainly don't think there were Nazi ones over in Japan, and they didn't damage our planes. So, no, I don't think so. I don't know what they were. Visiting guys from outer space, checking out what the heck are these idiots doing? Do you realize World War II was an incredible event? We killed 50 million of our own kind. We destroyed 1,700 cities. The planes evolved so quickly. There were bombing raids where over 500 planes dropped bombs on a given city in Europe. Nothing like this had ever happened before, and where civilians became the targets. World War I, it was trench warfare. Guys 20 feet apart in the trenches. Bloody, but the civilians weren't at all. World War II, we dropped how many bombs on Japan to start fires in the sort of paper buildings, almost paper. We killed thousands per bombing rate. innocent civilians. I mean, we always use that term, innocent, but they weren't part of the war effort. That wasn't like in the trenches.
Right.
So we're obviously worthy of attention based on one single line of reasoning on my part anyway. I presume that every advanced civilization is concerned about its own survival and security. Everybody we know is anyway. That being the case, you got to keep tabs on the primitives in the neighborhood, but only close tabs on those primitives who show signs of being able to bother you. At the end of World War II, and certainly starting early in the game, it was perfectly clear, because of new technology, that within 100 years, these idiots would be able to go out there. Three things: nuclear weapons, V-2 rockets, which were used in the early years of the war, and which were used to bomb England, not to deliver mail from Germany, and the development of radar, the first indication of sophisticated electronics. Now, isn't it amazing that at the end of World War II, as a matter of fact, in July 1947, there was only one place in the world where you could study all three of these technologies: southeastern New Mexico. That's where we're firing to capture German V-2s, White Sands Missile Range. That's where Trinity Site, we exploded our first A-bomb, July 1945. And that's where we had our best radar to track the rockets, which sometimes didn't go where they were supposed to go. Some of them went south instead of north. Very embarrassing for the government. So what I'm saying is it would have been perfectly obvious that something crazy was happening on planet Earth, and we have to be concerned. Not because we like them or don't like them or whatever. Because it won't take them very long before they'll be able to take their brand of friendship, which is obviously hostility, out to bother us. Any self-respecting alien would want to make sure that didn't happen. I think one of the reasons they're here is to quarantine us.
Well, we are the Australia of the universe, so they got to keep us hemmed in. So what do you got coming up here in the future? I know you do a lot of lectures, and do you have any...
Well, there is a place on my website, www.stantonfriedman.com, which lists future engagements. On the 12th through the 13th, I'll be in West Virginia, just outside Charleston, at the big extravaganza about flatwoods. Frank Fashina will be there and other speakers. I will be working on a movie up in New Hampshire about the Hill Case in September. And at the end of October, I'll be in Burlington, Wisconsin, giving 3 lectures in 3 days. It's a big conference about all kinds of strange things. Again, it's listed on the website. Next year, I'll be at the International UFO Congress in Laughlin, Nevada. That's February 22nd, I think. And I'll be in Roswell next year. I was there for 5 days this past year. I've already been invited and accepted. I was in Shag Harbor, Nova Scotia, where there was a fine crash of a saucer in 1967. That's October the 4th. And I've already accepted an invitation for next year's event. I believe it's August 7th, 8th. Probably not on my website yet, but it will be once we get all the details sorted out. So there's a possible conference in, where is that going to be? Atlanta in January. Just watch the website and you'll find out more. Oh, and would you believe I'm appearing at a science fiction conference in Memphis in March. I'm bearding the giant in its den. The science fiction writers tend to be very anti-UFO. But I'll take them on. What the heck?
I don't think you'll have any problems.
Well, I know more about science fiction than they know about flying saucers, that's for sure.
Well, I want to thank you for coming on the Grand Dark Conspiracy.
It's been my pleasure. I enjoyed it, and obviously I like the sound of my own voice, but that makes it easy for you anyway.
Oh yeah, I like the ones that want to talk. It makes it a lot easier for me.
Well, you don't like those 20-word questions where the guy nods his head in answer on a radio program?
Yes.
I've seen interviews like that at a radio station where the poor interviewer's going crazy to get the guy to say something. Anyway, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much.
Take it easy.
You too.